Welcome to the 20th presentation of the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures. And you've made it this far. I don't know how far we're going. But last time we were talking about King David and the young and the restless, or just the David and the Davidic covenant. Now, following the demise of David, and a little more turmoil in terms of family, etc. We get Solomon becoming the king, and he is known as the wisest man that ever lived. At least it's found in 1 Kings 3. Now, Solomon was still quite young, and he gets the kingdom, so God appears to him, and God asks him, "Tell me what you would like." Now, whatever. Rather than requesting power, money, long life, or whatever, Solomon asked for the gift of wisdom. Now, this impressed God and made God very happy. I'm not saying maybe impression is the wrong word, but this was a request that had pleased God. I mean, just imagine for yourself. If God said to you, you can have any one thing you want, what would it be? And so he asked for wisdom, and that was in order so that he could be a good ruler. So not only did God grant him the wisdom, but also wealth and power, things that he did not ask for. Now, because of being so wise, all of the wisdom literature in one way or another is attributed to Solomon. The wisdom literature in the Bible includes the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiasticus, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Song of Solomon, and Sirach. Now, he didn't personally write these books, but he started the tradition. Now, I kind of usually jokingly say, they kind of express Solomon's progress in life. And so when he was young, it's the song. As he became this practical ruler, having to deal with issues, it's Proverbs. And when he became a bitter old man, he wrote Ecclesiasticus, which asks the question, which is it better to be, a dead lion or a live mouse? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And hopefully we will get to take a look at this book at a later time as we go through. Now, what famous wisdom story there is about Solomon is about these two women. They each have a child. They live kind of next to each other. And one night, one of the women kind of like rolls over, smothers her baby, and has a dead child. So she goes and switches the dead child with a live child from the other woman. Now, whose baby is it? So they go to the king and want a decision. So Solomon listens to each of these women, and they will agree to whatever he decides. So he decides, cut the child in half. And that way you each get a half. And I wonder if it was from head to toe or no. The one mother is kind of agreeable to that, and the other says, no, let her have the child. And so, because she was the one who was more concerned with the child than herself, Solomon knew that she was the mother and gives her the child. Now, the most famous act of Solomon's rule is the building of the temple. David wanted to build it, and God said, no, this job belongs to your son. And Solomon did fulfill the divine promise. as you can see in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon completes and dedicates the great temple to the Lord. In the dedication ceremony, the Ark of the Covenant and other vessels, furnishings from Moses' tabernacle, into the temple itself. It symbolized a transition. From now on, the temple would take over from the tabernacle built in the wilderness. This is now where God has a permanent home in the midst of his people in Jerusalem. Now, in terms of its relationship with the covenants, you can see in the temple itself, it's the summation of all the covenants we've seen before. The temple was decorated on the inside with pictures and engravings of flowers and animals, with plenty of gold and jewels in the temple itself for its furnishings. The animals, the flowers, the gold, and the jewels call to mind Eden and the covenant with Adam. And then there's a stream that flows out of the side of the temple. It was named after one of the rivers that flowed from Eden in Genesis 2:13 and 1 Kings 1:33. The temple was also a kind of a new ark, reminding us of Noah's covenant. Just as Noah's ark was a floating Eden, so scholarship pointed out the intentional similarities in the way between the ark and the temple were built. For example, both were constructed with 3 levels or decks, Genesis 6 and 1 Kings 6. The exact place the temple was built is also highly significant. It was on the massive rock formation called Moriah, or Mount Moriah, 2 Chronicles chapter 3, where Abraham tried to sacrifice Isaac to God so many years before. In fact, as we have mentioned earlier, later Jewish tradition holds that the animal sacrifices offered in the temple were only pleasing to God because they reminded God of Isaac's self-offering on the sacrificial altar. And this was the same site that the temple was built. So you have a strong relationship there with the covenant with Abraham. The temple was also the successor of the tabernacle of the Mosaic covenant. Remember, we talked all the things from the Mosaic covenant were placed into the temple itself. So it symbolized especially the transfer of the ark into the temple. This act also symbolized the relationship between 2 covenants. The ark built by Moses moves inside the temple built by Solomon. This means, in a sense, that the Davidic covenant is absorbing, bringing into itself, or assimilating the Mosaic covenant. From now on, the son of David, heir of the Davidic covenant, will be responsible to make sure that Israel follows the Mosaic covenant. And of course, the temple itself is part of the very terms of the Davidic covenant. The fact that it is standing at all, and that Solomon is there to pray to God and dedicate it to him, 1 Kings 8, the visible proof that God has kept his covenant promises given to David, found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. For the ancient Israelites, as they worshipped, the importance of the temple can hardly be overemphasized. The temple was a standing reminder of the covenants with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. These 5 covenants. The big picture we've been talking about all along. That kind of everything is now flowing to the temple. And of course, for Christians, then this is going to be a key relationship with Jesus and these covenants. Now, it summed up all of salvation history. It represented all of God's relationships with his people. There was nothing greater than the temple except God himself. Many years later, Jesus will describe his own presence by saying, "Something greater than the temple is here." Matthew 12, verse 6. When we understand how great the temple it was, we realize then, taking from all these covenants, that Jesus was claiming to be God, because the temple is where God dwelt, and he was something greater than the temple, which means that he was God. Now, like every good story in the Hebrew Scriptures, you go up and you go way down. 1 Kings 8, which describes the completion and dedication of Solomon's temple, is the high point, the peak. Everything else now is going downhill. Sadly, the decline starts during Solomon's own reign. Toward the end of his life, Solomon had many, they say as many as 900 wives. I'm not even going to comment on that. So they say happy wife, happy life. Imagine trying to keep 900 women happy. And so his foreign wives, to keep them happy, persuaded him to build shrines to their pagan gods. And so obviously Solomon was no longer dedicated to the Lord as he had once been. 1 Kings 11. He also began to tax the people harshly, demanding lots. 1 Kings 12, verse 4. So, after Solomon's reign was over, the northern 10 tribes broke off from the house of David, which is, Jerusalem. When Solomon's son in Jerusalem, his son Rehoboam, notice, that's not a Jewish name. It's a pagan name. So here you have the Israelite king who had a conversation with God about wisdom, names his son by a pagan name. And so that shows, in a sense, how far Solomon had moved away from his relationship with God. So, the new son, the new king, puts a lot of tax. There were people already complaining about Solomon's taxes, and Rehoboam comes along and he even adds more. So the northern kingdom, the northern tribes, asked for change of policy. The other thing they did then, because they didn't get what they want, they chose a new king for the northern kingdom, not from the line of David. And they returned to the worship of golden calves, like Israel did in the desert, kind of negating the covenant. The southern tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin, they stayed faithful to the son of David and to the temple. The 10 tribes of the north were called the house of Israel. Remember that. Israel is north. The 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were called the house of Judah. So you have Israel and Judah, 2 kingdoms. However, these 2 Israelite kingdoms were too weak to exist for a very long time. So they would enter into a period of decline and people walking all over them. After about 200 years, the northern kingdom was completely wiped out by the Assyrians, a huge foreign empire that controlled most of the Fertile Crescent. If you look at a map of the Middle East, you see where there is fertile places where people can live in the desert, and it's crescent shaped. And the Assyrians came up and around, and they took Israel, and they dominated most of the Middle East, or the Fertile Crescent. And most of the Israelite population, the northern 10 tribes, were sent into exile to different places all over the known world and never heard from again. The southern kingdom, remember its name, Judah, held on for another 150 years, give or take, until it fell before the Babylonians. And that occurred in 587 before Christ, before the Common Experience, and took most of the Jews as captives to Babylon. And the thing is, when they were taking these captives, they didn't take the riffraff. They took the skilled people, the intellectuals, the royalty, the wealthy people. They took those people. So we will see, especially in the New Testament, what happens to a group of people who are left behind without any leadership, that they know they're Jews, but how do you be a Jew and how do you maintain your Jewishness? And so that will get you into the story of the Samaritans. Now, you have a vacuum. No political leadership. And what does God do at this point? He starts sending prophets. Now, he sent prophets, and there's a lot of prophets in the Bible. You are asked to name prophets, you're probably going to pick out one of the biggies, one of the big four. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. I mean, not Daniel. Yeah, Daniel. And the 12 minor prophets, which is Hosea through Malachi. Most of these prophets did their prophesying while the kingdoms were in steep decline, although a few ministered when they were talking about the coming back from the decline. Okay. So it's Ezekiel and Daniel who speak during the exile. And some spoke to the survivors, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, in terms of this big picture, we are going to focus on three great prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Each of these prophets, in their own unique way, are like weathermen. We have stormy weather, bad things are happening, but the future is sunny. So all we have to do is make it through to the future. And so there's going to come a time, we see this, that God is going to make a new covenant in the people's hearts, that's going to change everything. And the Son of David will return to his kingdom. So, the new covenant in Isaiah. Now, first, at this point, we're not going to get into breaking Isaiah down. Because some people say there's Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. There was an Isaiah, then there was a second person, maybe a student of the first, who continued the book, and then you have the third. This is not important at this time. Remember, our attempt is to look at the big picture of the book of Isaiah as a whole, not in terms of its individual parts. And his work is probably the best loved by Christians because, well, some people even call it like the fifth gospel, because there are many prophecies concerning the Messiah, and it's also quoted a lot in the New Testament, or Christian scriptures. Isaiah prophesied from about 740 to 700 BC. 40 years, that's a long time. That's why you start getting the divisions. He does his share criticizing the southern kingdom of Judah for being unfaithful to their covenant with God. He launches into harsh words almost from the start of the book. In chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged." And to say some good news now. And so this is his judgment upon the people. This is where he starts with this negative view. He goes on like that for a few more verses. And however, it's not the negative words in Isaiah we want to look at. Instead, we want to focus on his hope, the sunny weather in the future. Isaiah hopes all is that there's a really good, because the Son of David will be taking over God's people. In Isaiah 9, he writes, "But there will be no gloom for her," that's Israel, for Judah, "that was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. For to us a child is born, for to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore." Here Isaiah is saying that the people in the north, Israel, north of Israel, the northern tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, folks who have gotten the worst of it during the invasions, because when anybody's coming in that way, that's who they went through first. And they are going to be the first to see the birth of a new ruler, a son of David, who would be Mighty God, Everlasting Father. Though they had stormy weather, one day they will bask in the sunshine of David's heir. A few chapters later, Isaiah again talks about this great king coming from the line of David. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Now, Jesse, do you remember who Jesse is? Yeah. It's the beginning of the line of King David. And, well, and he continues on. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. For those of you who have studied for confirmation in the Catholic Church, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Those are the gifts of the Spirit. And yet the one to come, the chosen one of God, who is going to have the Spirit descend upon him, just that's what makes him a king. You know, the Spirit came to David, came to Saul, and came also to Solomon. So he shall be a king with all the gifts of kingship. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the girdle of his waist, and faithfulness the girdle of his loins. Some of this is very easy to understand. Some of it needs a little bit more clarification. By going back, the stump of Jesse. You remember, Jesse's got this big line, but it's really been cut down. What's left? And you just think, if you believe Jesus is this descendant he's talking about in prophecy, what was left of the kingships of Israel and Judah? Nothing of what it was from its glory days when you have a person like Herod. The branch that comes forth is a new royal son. He's anointed with the Spirit of the Lord, which gives him every kind of wisdom. Reminiscent somewhat of Solomon, who also had every kind of wisdom. So this new royal son is going to be equal to or greater than David and Solomon. Matthew 12:42. As a ruler, he's going to be especially kind to the poor and the meek. Much later in the book of Isaiah, the Lord actually speaks to this royal son of David who is coming in 42 verse 6. I, the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. Isaiah 42:6. Isaiah's words are striking because a person can't really be a covenant. You see, the covenant has always been between two people. One person cannot make a covenant. It's like one person getting married. Oh, by the way, some people try to marry themselves. It doesn't really work out. So a person can't be a covenant. But when that's looking at it, like we do so many other things, from our human perspective. Even so, Isaiah records God saying to his servant, who is probably the son of David, I have given you as a covenant to the people. So we can say that Isaiah foresees a future in which there's going to be a new covenant. This new covenant is somehow going to be God's special servant, who is the same person as the son of David mentioned in Isaiah 9 and 11. Let's look at one more passage, an astounding one that describes the covenant workings and who is going to be party to it. Isaiah 55, A through 3. Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in fatness. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Remember, in these verses, it's not Isaiah who's speaking, but God who is speaking. And he's talking to poor people, people who are thirsty, people who are hungry, and have no money to pay for anything to satisfy themselves. He's inviting them to a meal. No money, I'm starving, and this guy is offering me a meal. Really, to a feast where they can eat what is good and delight themselves in fatness. That's almost kind of like gluttony. No Weight Watchers here. No calorie counting. That's always been my view of heaven. If you've ever seen the movie Defending Your Life with Meryl Streep, where you could eat whatever you want, as much as you want, and not put on any weight. That sounds like heaven to me. Okay. He promises them a covenant. I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Now, the Hebrew word for covenant, English has 3 words. Steadfast, sure love. The Hebrew has just one, hesed. It takes those English words to translate hesed, because we don't have one word in our language. Hesed has a very special meaning, H-E-S-E-D. It refers to covenantal love, the kind of love that people in a covenant ought to show one another. It means love that is faithful, loyal, reliable, all those things. And that's why, that's kind of similar to what we would want people to have in a marital relationship. A covenantal love. That's why you see a lot of priests now talking about it's not a contract, it's a covenant, because of the special kind of hesed love. Now, I went too far. Turned too many pages. Now, so this new covenant is going to be an everlasting covenant. And for Catholics, that everlasting covenant, everlasting testament, should sound very familiar to you. If you go to Mass, you hear it in every single Mass. It is offered to the poor people It says my hesed for David, my covenant love for David. In other words, the new and everlasting covenant is really going to be the Davidic covenant. Only now it's opened up to include anybody who will recognize that they are poor and need God. It's a very important concept. The Anoim, which Jesus refers to in Blessed are the poor, are the people who are poor but believe everything they have comes from God. And they're thankful for it. I mean, you got life. You may not have a bed to sleep in, but you're living. You may not have food, but you have your health. So they're thankful for God. And Jesus says, in the Our Father, give us this day our daily bread. Give us today what we need for today, which implies that we are going to pray again tomorrow. So these poor people, they believe in God. They need God. They're not asking for long-term things. Just take care of me, God. And this is where the new covenant is going to reside. So any poor, hungry, thirsty person who comes and eats the meal that God offers them will enter into the Davidic covenant. Have you entered the Davidic covenant? Have you hungered and thirsted for God? And so that will conclude the presentation on Isaiah. And as we go on, then we go into individual books. After we get the big picture, Isaiah is fascinating. There's so many stories that are familiar to Christians. Especially, a virgin shall be with child. We'll talk all about that. So I thank you for joining. And I hope you're gaining something from this experience. And, hope you come again. You have been a blessing to me because I have to work. I have to put my heart and soul into learning a little bit more about the scripture every time I go through this. And today was kind of on the easy side. But it's important to know scripture so that we can be lifted up on eagle's wings. And so I hope to see you again. If you have any questions, you can come by office C105, right across from the chapel. My name's on the door, Father Jonathan Morse. You can send me an email at jonathan.morse@va.gov. And you can also, if you're missing some of the previous episodes, go to FJM Ministries, FJMMINSTRIES.org, and then select catechetical material, and all of the previous 19, and now this will be put on there, 20 Old Testament presentations will be found there. They're all there. Some of them are video, and some of them are just audio. So, may God bless you and keep you. May the road rise to meet you, and the wind be ever at your back. God bless you.